Friends, today we're gonna build an industrial building similar to this one, but it's not gonna be a component of a diorama, and it's also not gonna be a standalone building. Instead, it's gonna be something like this, a 3D picture frame. Now, I wanted to build something similar to this for a pretty long while, maybe more over a year, and this was just the perfect opportunity because I just finished the largest diorama of my life and I wanted to try something really relaxing. And also, as I said in that diorama video, up my game a little because I sort of lack practice and muscle memory when it comes to constructing and painting buildings in a more or less realistic way. And it was just the perfect coincidence that I realized that there's a book released by French modeler Emmanuel Novalier, who's an expert on making these sort of 3D pictures of old buildings. So I bought it with my own money, this is not a paid promotion, and there's a lot of inspiration. So pretty much as soon as I flipped through the pages, I knew what I was going to do. And you know what? I'm starting to feel a little silly holding these two props in my hands in the middle of the street, so let's get into the workbench and see how I made this thing. I started with a sheet of styrofoam that I've cut to the exact dimensions on my Proxxon foam cutter. But if you want to try a project like this and keep it really simple, you could use one of those foam food trays. I had a reference image that I was going to replicate as closely as possible, and I was even able to print the picture in 1/35 scale. To make things easier, I traced the basic contours on a millimeter paper, which I would then use to quickly transfer the shapes onto the styrofoam. There are many ways to approach this, and I could use a dedicated hot wire for many of these cutouts, but I wanted to keep the project as simple as possible. So, apart from cutting that initial slab from a large block of foam, I used common modeling tools for everything else. And basically, that was the boring part. Let's now make some bricks. This project was all about learning some new, better techniques and stepping up my miniature building game. When it comes to bricks, these initial steps are nothing new compared to my previous works. I had to make horizontal rows that are 2.5 millimeters apart, and although I like precision, small inaccuracies are not the end of the world. You see, old bricks were hardly identical, and sometimes the differences are quite noticeable. Spacing between them should be 8 millimeters, and once we enlarge the lines, each brick will get shrunken by about 0.5 millimeter, making them pretty much bang-on accurate in 1/35 scale. Some of them can be gently pushed inside, and this time I used a piece of 2 millimeter thick balsa plank, which is the perfect stamp for the job. And, of course, closely following my reference image, some bricks were ripped out. I absolutely adore these little details. Okay, so far we haven't seen anything new, but let's do a little magic trick. My biggest pet peeve with styrofoam is the fuzzy, sponge-like texture. But turns out that diluted Tamiya putty is a fantastic way of sealing and smoothing it out. But here's the thing, some thinners will absolutely destroy the foam, so it's best to try out what's safe to use. The only thing that didn't attack it was denatured alcohol, which does an okay job when it comes to thinning Tamiya putty, but is not great. Not only it smoothens out the fuzzy texture, but it also makes it non-porous, which is a huge help once we start painting the whole thing. We can also add more texture by stippling undiluted putty with a large paintbrush. But the best part? Check out how easy it is to add realistic cracks and other types of damage. This would never be possible with bare-bones styrofoam. There are a ton of crumbling bricks in my reference image, and it's a very nice detail that makes an otherwise monotonous brick wall much more interesting. Now we'll quickly treat the upper portion where we also have to scribe some complex shapes. There's a large circular vent right in the middle, so I quickly made it on my computer and printed it on my Photon Mono SE. You can find the 3D file on my Patreon if you're interested. We can see here that the bricks are laid in a pretty crazy pattern, and when we're faced with a situation where straight brick lines won't help us, we can make some elaborate brick stamp from metal, or, once again, use that piece of balsa wood to gently mark out their shape and then use a knife to scribe them into the foam. The rest was pretty standard, but here it's worth noting that every second row has the bricks oriented the other way, so their shorter 4mm side is facing towards us. So yeah, here's the finished brick wall, sealed and textured with Tamiya putty, and it's a night and day difference compared to my previous works. Now we must replicate those massive concrete pillars, and I already tried out some techniques down here. Again, putty will be crucial in this process. I'm going to use thin sheets of foam which I've cut with a hot wire, and yes, it goes against my original plan, but to be honest, making them from thick, solid blocks and gluing them to the brick wall would have led to even better results. But anyway, I had to firmly glue this styrofoam origami in place, and instead of PVA glue, I tried dedicated glue for styrofoam. It's a sort of sticky paste and it creates an instant bond. It's neat, but not game-changing. Okay, once again, I need to flood the surface with diluted Tamiya putty. You can add multiple layers because the thicker the putty is, the better. Once it is dry to the touch, but not really dry, we can start embossing the board form texture. For that, I simply used a plank of balsa wood. It's important to push the planks as closely to each other as possible so the gaps between them won't become unrealistically thick. And it's also important to keep them pretty horizontal if possible. Because the foam became softer for a while, all thanks to the putty and alcohol, it's possible to sculpt and enhance these lines even further. So that's the result after I blended the concrete with the brick wall using foam putty and giving it one more round of texture. The pillar on the left was easier to make as a separate piece, and even the texture was much more realistic. Once again, Tamiya putty is an absolute game changer here because I was never able to add cracks as realistic as this. We can even push some of these cracks inwards to add a more three-dimensional look to the part. I mean, how cool is that? There's some preparation needed before adding the plastic details, namely adding a simple wooden frame that will hold the metal gate in place, and small sections of stucco made from thin sheets of foam that will also hold the window in place. These were again sealed with putty, making it possible to add some subtle cracks here and there. The metal gate is made from a single sheet of evergreen styrene. All the details on the gate were made from evergreen strips, and this is why it's awesome to have them at hand if you do a little bit of scratch building every now and then. Gaps were simply engraved with a Tamiya scriber, and once we apply a pin wash here, it'll look as if the gate is made from individual pieces. Hinges are a very important detail and they can elevate any model if they're made realistically. As such, I like to make them from strips of lead foil because it's extremely easy to bend it over a piece of wire or a plastic rod. It's situations like this when it's better to use various materials because each has its own strengths and weaknesses. Speaking of different materials, I made a few simple handles from copper wires. These were inserted into pre-drilled holes and fixed in place with black superglue from VMS. The excess was removed with their debonder, and I gotta say, I love VMS as a company. They have so many awesome modeling solutions, and if I try really hard, I might even convince them to start selling their true night shift certified styrofoam. In the meantime, if you'd like to try their products, you can use my discount codes and buy either directly from them or Michigan Toy Soldier. Links down in the description. The window frame was more complicated because my opening didn't have exactly right angles, and the frame had to be glued from thin strips of evergreen styrene. Also, these strips can't overlap each other, so that added another layer of frustration. But, you know, sometimes we just have to grind through tasks like this. The surface was a bit messy, so I quickly sealed and textured everything with very diluted Tamiya putty, but this time diluted with Mr. Cement S. The backside was closed off with another piece of styrene, and this will later be painted black to make it a sort of fake shadow behind the window. Finally, I just had to make the corrugated metal roof and a few extra details. This time I went with copper foil that I annealed with fire and a quick dip in tap water. I made this simple bending jig for one of my previous projects, and it can make pretty nice corrugated metal sheets if you provide it with enough brute force. I also added some flashing that would nicely tie everything together and provide a good foundation for the roof. I know PVA glue is designed for porous surfaces and not very good for metal, but if you apply enough of the stuff, it can glue together pretty much anything. Lastly, I added these pipes made from plastic rods, and with those out of the way, we're pretty much ready for painting. Every other detail will be easier to add afterward. I mean, it's not like we don't already have enough details to work with, right? Well, by now it's a pretty well-known fact that I like to start with a coat of dark primer, either black or very dark brown, and then do all my post-shading stuff. But here, I was inspired by Emmanuel's work and tried the exact opposite, a very pale, well, pure white coat of primer. But while I was at it, I figured I'd spray a very thin coat of diluted dictan, which will act as a base color for the concrete. The point of all of this is to use black ink as a heavy wash, and this one is ancient, dating back to Czechoslovakia. I'll add a few drops of tap water to make it less opaque. So what we're gonna do is to cover the entire surface with it. Because the styrofoam is sealed with putty, the ink won't get absorbed but instead flow nicely on the surface, outlining every little detail. It works especially well on the concrete because, I mean, just check out how good the pillar looks after it dried, right? Inks have very specific properties, especially the way they flow and dry, that make them very unique. I can praise it without feeling like I'm trying to sell you another pointless product because, I mean, the manufacturer doesn't even exist anymore, right? Well, the only place where it didn't work so smoothly was the brick wall, and it was because the styrofoam in those deep brick lines wasn't sealed and it acted as a repellent. So instead I had to manually brush it into each line. Once it dried, I gently sanded the surface, removing the ink from the most raised surfaces. You might be asking what's the purpose of this type of base coat, and well, it's post-shading because we have our fake shadows, but also texturing. Let's now paint the concrete, and although it looks great as it is already, I'm going to follow my reference image and try to replicate the real thing as closely as possible, using only 4 acrylic paints because limiting your palette is very helpful in these situations. Well, the first steps are very simple because you're just applying those acrylic paints with a sponge in a random manner. There's no rule saying that you should start with the darkest and finish with the lightest one. In fact, it's good to have a reference image and try to mimic the shades and their placement. In case of this pillar, there was a more yellowish tone towards the left side and an almost white finish towards the right. On the large horizontal one, the middle portion was yellowish, while the sides were all kinds of grey, sporting more of a warmish hue. Another layer of black ink was necessary to subtly tie everything together and also reinforce some of that lost shading. After that, we'll switch to dry brushing. The random spotty texture still needs to be blended, but subsequent washes would make the surface too dark. Again, what color should be used depends on the finish you're trying to achieve. Now, of course, ink can be used for so many effects, and there were a lot of huge stains of moisture on the concrete. This is the perfect medium for the job because not only it takes seriously longer to dry compared to diluted acrylic paints, but even when it dries and you don't manage to blend it absolutely perfectly, it'll sort of feather itself out. A single bottle of black ink, and what a difference it made for me. I also used it to outline the board-formed texture from the bottom as a sort of fake shadow of sorts. Some of the stains looked a little flat, so I gave them a very gentle round of dry brushing, and because the paint only stays on the raised portions of the texture, it created some nice random shapes here and there. Finally, just as I did with the dark outline, I also added a highlight. I spent way too much time figuring out how to make those lines, so I was definitely making them clearly visible. So yeah, there we have it. One of my favorite types of surface and one that I've struggled with in the past. Honestly, I was a bit disappointed when I compared the finished result to the textured base coat, but that just goes to show you how effective the black ink truly is. Okay, let's now give it some vibrant colors and paint the bricks. Once again, I kept my palette very limited and based it on my reference image. Well, if there's one thing I learned during this project, it's that the variety in brick color doesn't mean having every neighboring brick painted in a different tone. In fact, they can all have the same color, and the subtle differences are caused by weathering. Or in this case, the different tones are sort of clumped into several regions. So once again, I kept a close eye on my reference and tried to follow it as closely as possible. The paints I prepared in my wet palette didn't always match the tones, so I often had to mix them together. Not much to say here except how the ink-washed light primer helped us to immediately achieve some visual texture, and how the variety in tones looks way more natural than my previous attempts. Let's quickly do some basic weathering with just 3 diluted paints. My main objective was to establish the basic tonal variety in a more subtle way. If I saw some dusty bricks in the reference, I applied dusty acrylics in that area. There were lots of very dark, almost black bricks on the other side, and this effect is caused by moisture. Because, as you'll see, the rain gutter is gonna be broken, so all the water would have just streamed down right down the wall. And all of a sudden, after a few passes with the paintbrush, the facade took a whole new, more natural look. Let's now add the mortar, using my favorite Modellbauspachtel. I kept thinking about some better way to replicate it because so far I found the acrylic putty rather smooth for the effect. But as it turns out, there's no reason to replace something that's already perfect for the job. So what I did here was to apply the putty in a small area, and before it started drying, which actually happens very fast, I gently stippled it with a soft paintbrush, creating a very nice texture. Once again, I followed my reference, and the distribution of mortar on the real thing is very uneven. But pure white mortar is somewhat aggressive and overpowering, so let's tone it down a notch and match the reference image. Most of it has your standard grayish color, and a very diluted paint was more than enough to do the job. I had to be careful though, because the paint likes to seep everywhere and give the bricks a very desaturated look. It was even worse with the left side, which is completely black, and here I again used the legendary ink. But hey, after carefully painting over the mortar lines, I'd say it looked pretty good. However, small corrections were needed, this time with a skin color. Basically, all of these remaining steps are just minor corrections and some finishing touches. Adding lightness where it was lost with the black wash, adding dustier surfaces where needed using those sandy colors, extending the streaks from the board-formed concrete, adding a light orange wash into those crumbled bricks where the less weathered core is exposed, and let's not forget the eye-catching moss deposits where the heaviest moisture is concentrated. So many cool effects with just a few brushstrokes. I mean, this brickwork is a night and day difference compared to my previous buildings, but there's still a lot of room for improvement in future projects, but that can be only achieved with more practice. Okay, let's now add some of the details. I'll show you how I painted all of the rusty surfaces in a moment, but for now, let's focus on another cool thing. There's not much welding detail you can add on a brick wall, but there's something equally cool. Most of the time, you see various fixtures and whatnot held in place with cement, and this is easily replicated with foam putty. Just a few small random chunks of cement, slightly tinted with a grey acrylic wash. But we can make it even more pronounced. There's a hole in this wall, and a pipe is coming out of it. The surrounding area is fixed with cement, and here I applied it in a very haphazard way, while also utilizing a soft brush to give it some texture. Because it's a relatively large spot, I colored it with diluted grey paint, But to bring out that sweet texture, I also gave it a quick wash with black ink. Now for the pipe. I made it from a plastic evergreen rod and strips of lead foil. The base coat is just a very dark acrylic mixture, just to cover up the entire surface. I applied some gray tones with a sponge to give it some quick texture, and the rest was about diluted rust washes. In fact, once the initial effects are done, it's easier to apply the finishing touches when the thing is already superglued on the wall. We can find lots of interesting and colorful details on walls, such as this loosely hanging cable made from a 0.3mm copper wire. With just a few simple details, the wall looks much more interesting and realistic. So let's now treat the window and the gate. Well, here I wanted to up my game a little because a dark rusty finish would have been quite monotonous. A quick round with a sponge solved this issue, and I added some random chunks of leftover paint still holding onto the metal surface. Then I continued with more rust washes and more stippling with a sponge, just to get an interesting, dark, corroded surface. The window frame is pretty small, so there's no need to be very elaborate with these effects. What makes it more interesting are the glass panels, especially the broken ones. As usual, I've got them from clear acetate foil, and because they're so broken, I glued them one by one. There are only 3 that are more or less intact, and the rest are just random shards of glass. To give it that proper aged look, I sprayed them with VMS flat varnish. Very old glass is almost impossible to see through because of all the dust and grime that has collected on the surface over the years. You probably guessed it, but the black ink is the perfect tool for achieving that grimy buildup. Here I decided to deviate from my reference image and add a few more elements that would not only make the window more interesting, but also block the view so you wouldn't have to look at a black painted sheet of styrene in the background. Metal signs and random pieces of wood are the most common items used for blocking windows, and I finally found some good use for those sets of printed signs from RT Diorama. Plywood is one of those surfaces that I avoided for the longest time, because quite frankly, I just had no idea how I would replicate it. But after downloading some reference images from the internet and reading Emmanuel's book where he replicates wood completely from styrene, I decided to give it a try. Turns out, texturing plastic with a metal wire brush is so easy and way more efficient than using a real wood. And applying the acrylic paints straight onto the white surface leads to some very nice results. It totally depends on the surface you're trying to replicate because there's just so much variation in real life, and I went for a grayish, rodden look. As such, I added a fair amount of gray tones with a sponge, and according to a reference image, a stain of moss that truly accentuates that feeling of abandonment. Once again, the black ink was a total game changer here because it led to effects unachievable with regular diluted acrylic paint. I mean, we can even push it around with an airbrush while it's drying, which will create awesome and very realistic stains caused by moisture, just like in real life. And there we have it. It doesn't look so bad for a first try, at least I think. It also adds a lot of visual interest to the window because what originally was just a flat piece of plastic suddenly has layers and layers of effects and different materials. Okay, let's see what can be done with the metal gate. Here I started with my traditional approach, which I sometimes use on armor models. Basically a dark rusty base coat with dark primer, reddish brown Tamiya paint, and 2 generous layers of chipping fluid from VMS. The entire thing was then covered with a thin coat of white, which will act as a base color for that faded surface. Many times when I perform hairspray chipping, I try to make the chips sort of aesthetically pleasing, focusing them around sharp edges and stuff. Here I try to follow the reference image and replicate the shape and placement of the largest chips as accurately as possible. So now I gave it another coat of chipping fluid without sealing the previous layer and sprayed a very thin coat of pale blue in a cloudy pattern, again following my reference image. This was also worn down but didn't provide much contrast. However, it's always better to start with a pale base color because it gives you infinite options to adjust it to your liking. Case in point, after sealing the gate with VMS flat varnish, I went ahead with diluted blue from AK and started painting these random maps of leftover, less faded paint. Some of the water went through the layer of varnish and reactivated the chipping fluid, which led to some pretty awesome textured results. The only moment where I used enamels was outlining the details. Black wash around each wing of the gate and dark umber for everything else. Not only it makes every feature pop, but it also tidies up the messy, mottled surface. The rust effects were completely recreated with acrylic paints. I realized that it's much easier to build up the opacity using acrylics, which dry super fast, rather than blending thick layers of enamels or oil paints. These new AK 3rd generation acrylics are really good, and I can't recommend them enough. This year I teamed up with AK because I enjoy working with their products, and if you like them as well, you can buy them from their site using my affiliate link in the video description, and you can also use my promo code to get a nice discount. You'll find everything down below. So that's the finished gate, and even the red number was brush painted with diluted acrylics. What I love the most about it is how it slides smoothly in place, and I can fix it with a few drops of super glue from the other side. However, I didn't like the layout of the chips, even though I followed the reference image. So I decided to offset them a little with another sign, again from RT diorama, and did a bit of acrylic weathering on that one as well. The fuse box also comes from RT, and the rest is just, scratch built. Now I had to paint the roof, and here I also tried something else. Brush painting on top of chipping fluid. Turns out it's not the best way to approach corroded metal, but it's a technique that will create wonders if you want to replicate old painted wood. It leads to some exciting crackle effects, and the chips are also relatively big, which is exactly what we want on wooden surfaces. Well, it's not exactly what I had in mind here, but I guess it'll work well enough for us tonight. I also had an opportunity to try painting old, rusty, zinc-plated metal. I already tried it before in my Conqueror diorama, but this time I went for a more textured approach. Let's check it out on these rain gutters. I printed my own gutter, again, you'll find the file on my Patreon if you're interested, and made the downspouts from evergreen plastic tubes. The ones I've been using are quite thin because they're the only ones I have, but I'll definitely buy more diameters in the future. As for painting, I gave them a dark brown rusty base coat, a layer of chipping fluid, and a pale grey coat mixed from Tamiya paints. Here you can see I did some quick mapping with a very light grey acrylic paint and gave the whole thing a generous wash with black ink. Gutters are a real pain in my bag if I try to paint them while I hold them in my hands, so I superglued them to the roof and added the rust effects this way. Once again, they're done with acrylics, just like on the metal gate. All that was left to do now was attaching the facade to a picture frame. I bought several frames from IKEA, but my poor planning and lack of foresight led to some issues. Basically, I had to hack and modify it to some extent, otherwise I wouldn't be able to fit the facade. I already bought some more, which are more suitable, and I'll talk about this important part in some other video. For now, let's just say the presentation isn't totally perfect, but I think that's to be expected if you're trying something for the very first time. After all, my first diorama didn't have perfectly smooth wooden sides either, right? So instead I actually became fond of these first tries, with all their imperfections. Okay, so what's there to say, my friends? Well, first of all, it's pretty hard to give you those usual 360 shots because this is basically a picture in a frame. Yes, the picture is three-dimensional, but still flat in its essence, so these shots will have to do. I wanted to try this type of modeling for more than a year because it allows you to focus on the fun parts, detailing, trying to be as delicate as possible, trying to capture the realistic worn look of an old building, and, most importantly, It doesn't take up too much space. Also, it was a great, relaxing project, which is something I really needed after finishing the largest diorama of my life. So let me know what you think about it, because even though I just wanted to try it out, I actually fell in love with this kind of modeling and would love to do more in the future. In the meantime, I want to sincerely thank every single one of you for watching these videos, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be sitting here building models for a living, and I can't thank you enough for this amazing opportunity. All of this is also possible thanks to my incredible patrons. My whole Patreon page is like a Night Shift magazine subscription, as I post there pretty often, and you'll get updates from my workbench where I share my thoughts and insights. We can get in touch through DMs, comments and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos, and those stay there forever, so you can always get back to them without even keeping track of these official uploads on my channel. I also have some extra goodies, such as 3D models which you can download and print for your own projects, such as those that I used on this model, a bunch of real-life references for nature, old buildings and so on. And last but not least, these high-resolution photos which show the model in more detail than video ever could. It would help me a lot, but you know, no pressure. Anyway, my friends, this is the last video of 2023, so with that, I want to wish you very happy and peaceful holidays and splendid new year. Enjoy your time with your family and loved ones, relax and just have a good time. And don't forget to actually build those models, don't just collect them, okay? Anyway, I'll see you in January with another video, and in the meantime, I'm signing off. Cheers!